Hi, this is part 3 of the Chapter 6 PowerPoint on Motown Pop and Southern Soul. And I'd like to begin by reviewing some of the gospel music characteristics that overlap with soul music characteristics. First of all, both of these styles are going to tend to have slow tempos, start soft dynamics. So basically a more gentle beginning to kind of bring us into um, in a gospel tradition, something that's going to lead to a very spiritual climax, whereas in a soul tradition is going to lead to a very intense, emotional, exciting climax. But that slow, soft beginning is often a parallel that is connected between both of these styles. The rhythms will get more energetic in both of these styles. The dynamics will get louder. The range of the voices and instruments will get higher. A very common feature in both soul and gospel. They're going to often have very similar instrumentations and timbres, both featuring the piano, the organ, sometimes even a choir in both of these styles. Other church timbres we'll hear, we'll have a lot of these rock instruments like the rhythm sections, drum set, electric guitar, electric bass, tambourine features in both of these as well. Melismatic singing, something I've mentioned before, is going to be very common in both gospel and soul. This is when the singer is going to have many, many notes for one syllable of text. For example, if I sang, I love you, that would not have any melismatic singing. But if I did something like, I love you, excuse me, but that is technically an example of melismatic singing. Many notes for one syllable of text. Gospel music is going to be much more syncopated than your standard traditional church hymn that tends to just be chord, 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 singing on a very steady beat with steady rhythms. Gospel and soul are going to be very syncopated, where the rhythms are unexpected. Da, 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 da. So you have an unexpected rhythmic energy where it's not always on the beat. And then a lot of lyrical repetitions and yeah, yeah, yeahs or praise the Lord's, very repeating a line again and again and again is going to be a very common characteristic in both gospel and soul. So that leads me to another type of soul music that's going to become increasingly popular by the end of the 60s, and that's what we call Southern soul. We first studied sweet soul back in the late 50s with groups like the Drifters. That kind of southern, that sweet soul sound builds into early Motown. And again, one of the key characteristics of sweet soul is that it does have this gospel connection, like we just described. However, a lot of sweet soul is going to be adjusted or packaged in such a way that it is it doesn't have as much of the improvisation. It doesn't have as much of the open-endedness to a live performance. It's going to be streamlined and packaged so it can fit onto a radio time play of 2.5 minutes. It's going to be packaged in such a way that it is palatable to white audiences as well as to black audiences in the United States at this time. Whereas Southern Soul is going to, I believe Kovacs uses the word unbuttoned to describe the more authentic and less adjusted way to try and make the music sound palatable to audiences that are not coming from the African American culture or community. Southern Soul is going to be is not going to try to change itself or adjust itself to be marketable to white audiences. Not surprisingly, it still sounds like a lot of fun, and it sells very well in white and black audiences. But when we're talking about Southern Soul, we really need to start by talking about Atlantic Records in the early 60s, and one of their lead producers named Jerry Wexler, who was especially interested in finding African American pop music that was not adjusting itself, that was not trying to market itself towards white audiences, that was trying to sound more like what you would hear if you were going to a club and hearing these groups perform live. Let's get that live sound into these recordings, and that's one of the things that makes Southern soul different. Is it's being more authentic to an original soulful musical tradition. So when we're talking about Southern soul artists, we're thinking about people like Otis Redding and Wilson Pickett that are going to have a lot more of this gospel emotional expression that is not packaged or adjusted for audiences outside of an African American community. Memphis and Stax Records are going to be one of the lead companies that are putting out what comes to be known as this Southern soul sound. Stax is actually not really an acronym. It's a combination of two of the lead company owners, Jim Stewart and Estelle Axton. They took the first two letters of their last name, mushed that together, and that's how we come up with the record company named Stax. Stax also had a studio band like the Wrecking Crew in LA or the Funk Brothers in Motown. The Stax studio band was Booker T and the MGs, and they actually had their own hit tune called Green Onions. You may not know it by name, but if you listen to Green Onions, I bet you'll recognize it. It was a very popular, unusual tune from the 60s in that it didn't have any lyrics. It was just an instrumental soul hit called Green Onions. Check it out. But Booker T and the MGs not only had their hit song Green Onions, they also did all of the background band music for many of the Stax artists coming out of that studio. Folks like Sam and Dave, Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, many others artists, all coming out of this Memphis sound. And Otis Redding, definitely one of the most important artists coming out of Stax Records, with many crossover hits in rock and pop and R&B. And Sam and Dave were an example of a vocal duo kind of comparable to the Four Tops or the Temptations. Wilson Pickett is going to be a very important artist as well. His tune In the Midnight Hour has a really distinctive backbeat feel in which there's just a bit more of a delay in how some of the rhythm section interacts with the horn line, which interacts with the guitar and the vocalists, and it almost has kind of a jazz aspect to it in the way that the rhythm is. The pulse and the tempo of the music is definitely in the pocket, as we say. It's feeling the pulse, but it has a much more delayed backbeat feel that is very characteristic of this Southern soul style. So another aspect of Stax music that kind of distinguishes it from even other Southern soul of the time is the way it would include organ, horn, a very funky bass, which has a lot of syncopated aspects to it, a very biting, short rhythm guitar sound, and not much backing vocals. A good example, again, of that is his song, In the Midnight Hour. And it really is if you kind of listen to In the Midnight Hour side by side with Baby Love, you really get a clear sense of what the difference is between a more polished soul sound coming out of Motown and the Southern soul sound that has that more authentic, again, as Kovacs would say, kind of an unbuttoned, authentic African-American pop sound. So taking a closer look at the song In the Midnight Hour, this is coming out of Stax Records in 1965, simple verse, 4/4 meter, horn line, drums, bass, electric guitar, but this is coming straight from a gospel hymn line, my Lord comes to me in the midnight hour. But when you listen to this, it's not going to sound like church music right away. It's deaf, but it's going to have some of those references and characteristics of the gospel music. Try to see if you can feel the way beat 2 and beat 4 have a slight delay. And when I say slight, I'm talking microseconds, but listen for that slight delay and how that compares to some of the other pop songs we've been listening to in this chapter and in other chapters.